Hiraeth, the sound of a key turning swiftly in the lock jerked her out of sleep. In the semi-darkness, she guessed at the hint of a window, framed by heavy curtains of the type people hang in old houses to keep the cold air out. Searching for bearings in the obscurity, she busied her fingers, finding the ruggedness of a stone wall to her right. It felt damp and gritty to the touch, reminding her of the ruins of ancient Welsh castles. She had visited so many whose name haunted her: Carrick Kennan, Castlevere, Kilgaren, all remnants of the pride of men. Built, besieged, destroyed, rebuilt, eventually abandoned. Swinging her legs to one side of the bed, she used her big toe to locate the floor. The soft flesh of her foot brushed against what felt like a thick hide. Instinctively she withdrew, pulling herself into a ball, an animal under attack, shielding her face with one arm. All she could hear was silence. After a while she uncoiled herself, stretching her toes to dip into the darkness where the beast might be, listening for breathing, scratching, rustling, any indication that another living thing was in the room with her. Nothing. Her underfoot met a shaggy texture. It was cold to the touch. She reached forward and placed the full palm of her hand on the ground. Wool, she thought, her sheepskin thrown on the icy slated floor. Reassured, she stood, circling the edge of the bed until she found the wall again. The smell of wet earth emanating from the stones reminded her of a visit to Dan Erogarth caves, a scent of mold growing in permanent darkness, fed by rivulets carved into the rock. In her ears, blood thumped as loud as a drum. Forcing herself to move, she shuffled along the wall, but found nothing but rock. She started to panic and moved away from the guiding safety of the wall. Crossing the darkness, she reached a thick velvet fabric, grabbed a handful to pull it open. Using both hands, she drew the shape of a wooden door, fumbling for the cold feel of a metal handle. There, round and fitted in her palm. She rattled it left and right. It was locked. For a moment, she placed a heated ear against the cool of the metal, hoping for any hint of what might lie on the other side. Still nothing. Dropping to one knee, she rested her forehead against the door panel, trying to clear her thoughts. The organic feel of wood brought her a sense of calm. The flickering of a candlelight from beyond the door allowed her a brief glimpse at her room, before a cold gust of wind snuffed the fragile picture. A bed, table and chair in a windowless cell, what the French called oubliette, a medieval underground gaol where prisoners were left to rot, condemned to be forgotten. The thought made her shiver. With that sunlight, she had no way to know how long she had been down here. Her head was pounding. The last thing she remembered was knocking on the door of a grey manor house. It stood alone at the hilt of a Pembrokeshire hill, overlooking the sea. That's right. She'd been visiting an acquaintance in Broadhaven when she found herself stranded because of what the garage had called a freak mechanical failure. Down at the pub, she had asked for direction to the nearest B&B. A crooked old man nestled on a rocking chair in the corner by the earth had suggested an ancient manor about 3 miles away. There you might find lodging, he had said, adding that it was past the tourist season and everywhere else had long since closed. Walking up a muddy path away from town, she had reached the dusty glass panel door of an imposing rectangular grey stone building. There had been no sign that anyone was in, but the man in the pub had seemed sure, and the window was littered with encouraging travel scheme stickers. She had knocked, the door bristling under her fist. Clearly it wasn't locked. Behind her, the cold of dusk had rapidly dropped onto the land. The building had been vast enough for her knocks to remain unanswered. Stepping in, she had called a cheery "hello." The door had slammed shut behind her as if someone else in the manor had opened the door. She'd taken another step. "Can I help you?" the eternal voice had made her jump. Scanning the dark corridor ahead, she had distinguished the shape of a cadaveric woman with frail features which contrasted with the deep ebony of her hair. The scene from the Addams Family had flashed into her mind. "Yes, hello, a room for the night, please," she had muttered awkwardly, she now thought. The woman in front of her had made her feel like a trespasser, as if her presence had interrupted some sinister doing. Impenetrable, the woman had pointed at a dusty ledger placed on a small wooden table dressed in a yellow doily. "Would you and your husband sign the book?" That's right, Gwyn had been with her. How could she have forgotten? He had been right next to her all along. In the pub, he had told the crooked old man how they were no tourists and they had only visited one of his old schoolmates about a drum kit he wanted to take to their new London floor. Clara was reading history at the university when she had met him, a local music celebrity who had caught her eye at one of the midweek concerts held up and down the pubs lining the St. Mary streets in Cardiff. "Look a lad, eh?" the old man had inquired, lifting his chin. "Not worried about Hiraeth, then?" he had asked, his voice distorted by the creaking of his chair. Hiraeth. She had heard the Welsh word spoken before. It didn't mean so much homesickness as a longing for the land. It reminded her of the slogan on the red t-shirt his housemate had brought him as a leaving present. "You can take the boy out of Wales, but you can't take Wales out of the boy." "Oh, we're not married," she had told the woman, whilst Gwyn was writing his name in the guest book. The look on the lady's face had made her feel an inexplicable pang of shame, as if she'd just been caught in bed by her mother. "I'll prepare 2 rooms, then," the woman had decreed, with a finality which didn't invite argument. "Do make your way to the dining room. I'll bring you tea." Before they could thank her, she had disappeared in the bowels of the poorly lit corridor. The dining room was huge, painted white, and clasped in wide oak beams that gave the space the feel of a medieval hall. On one side, large bay windows fell to give the living space an air of modernity. Through the glass, she could see the grey Welsh sky, merging with the tortured sea the colour of dark slate. It occurred to her tourists would pay good money for such a spectacular view of the Pembrokeshire coast, but on this day, out of season and in the absence of other guests, the place felt foreboding. 2 bedrooms, eh? Gwyn chuckled, his eyebrow raised in amusement. She shrugged. This place was ancient, perched at the end of the world, and the lady of the house had made her feel nervous. "What did you want me to say?" she challenged him. "This is the only place open for miles." "Did you really want me to lecture her on women's liberation?" "Excuse me, good lady, but we already know each other biblically, so 1 bedroom will do just fine." Gwyn's hearty laugh filled the empty room with new life, forcing her to drop a guard and smile. Their cheeriness was interrupted by the clattering of cups. They watched as the woman brought in a pot of tea, supplemented with stale-looking biscuits served on a small rectangular tray, which she placed on the table between them. In the declining light from the windows, she noticed the woman's skin was smoother than she had first thought, her hair peppered with intermittent streaks of white, so that she simultaneously looked young and old, probably the product of a lifetime in isolation. "We are pretty quiet here in the off-season," she said, as if she had read her mind. "Will you want dinner?" "No," Gwyn replied. "We ate at the pub, thank you." His response made her frown, maybe at the loss of a rare income, or maybe a sign of disapproval at the mention of a public house. From her studies, Clara knew there had been a strong Puritan tradition in remote parts of Wales in years gone by, but her experience had been of a warm and welcoming people, nothing to prepare her for the way this woman made her feel. "Once you've had your tea, I'll take you to your rooms," the woman said. They drank in silence under her watchful eye. Once they were done, they followed her obediently up a winding staircase, which reminded Clara of a visit to Caerphilly Castle, an attempt at showing Gwyn what she was so passionate about. The steps were worn out by thousands of invisible footsteps. From the inside, the place felt ancient. "This is you," the host said, indicating a heavy door carved into the wall, a large iron key acting as a doorknob. "We are a little further on," she told Gwyn, pointing at climbing narrow stairs. Submitting to the oddity of the situation, Clara bid them both good night, and stepped into a little room coiled around the stairwell, lit up by a single window revealing fields stretching from the back of the building as far as the eye could see. Another door opened onto a smaller room still, where she found a stand-up sink and a supported bath. The gaps between the sash window panes let freezing air through, bringing shivers down her spine. She decided a bath would help. The creaking taps let out a thick-looking liquid the colour of rust. A smell of sulphur filled the room, making her gag. Giving up on the idea, she took her boots off and buried herself under the scratchy woolen blankets, fully dressed. A warm torpor came over her, and she soon fell asleep. Standing in her dark, humid cell, she realized the woman must have put something in the tea, drugged her somehow. Thinking of it, she didn't remember seeing the kind of turret you would have expected with this sort of stairwell. From the outside, the manor house had appeared a homogeneous grey block built atop the cliff, whereas this room she was in had the distinctive musk of underground basements. Someone must have carried her here. Shaking off a vision of her listless body being manhandled through narrow passages by a cloaked Welsh Quasimodo, she thought of Gwyn. Moving to London had been her ambition. A history degree didn't give her many job prospects in Cardiff. She had no intention of becoming a teacher, and after 3 years of dilapidated castles, she had resigned herself to the fact that Cadw, the Welsh heritage arm of the devolved government, simply didn't have enough money to protect the country's dwindling heritage. It was a losing battle she wasn't prepared to fight. Her future was working in London at one of the big auction houses like Sotheby's, specializing in something glamorous like the Impressionist and modern art catalogues. Gwyn had been reluctant at first, content with his gregarious life. She had made a compelling case. One musician wouldn't want to be in London after all. This weekend had been her idea too, a compromise to give him a chance to catch up with his mates before leaving. She whimpered at the thought of the woman frying Gwyn's liver in the attic. Get a grip, she told herself. Remembering the candle, she reasoned that whoever had brought her to this place had intended to come back. Picturing the layout of the room, Clara managed to find a chair. She pulled the drapes shut and took position next to the door. With her hands firmly clasped around the chair and her back pressed against a dank wall, she waited. The moisture from the wall seeped through her clothes into her hair, running down her face as if she herself had become part of the stone. Hoping to quench her rising thirst, she pulled out her tongue to catch a drop, immediately spitting the water out. She hadn't expected it to be salty. The room must have been cut into the Pembrokeshire cliff, she deduced. A loud rumble interrupted a silent monologue, the sound of engulfing wind into a long tunnel. She heard approaching footsteps, then the sound of a key being pushed into the lock, grating, screeching. She felt the cold on her face as the velvet curtains whooshed open. Bracing herself, she lifted the chair and swung it with all her force into the appearing shape. She heard a heavy thud, dropped her weapon, and ran into the tunnel towards the rising sound of breaking waves, eyes fixed on where the light came from. Don't look back, she murmured to herself, as if to do so would condemn her to the oubliettes forever. Finally, she reached the cliff. In the light of dusk, she sought the coastal path, which she followed back to the village. Help! She screamed, barging through the door of the pub. The locals turned to consider this dishevelled tourist, muttering about kidnapping and secret passages. A few men agreed to walk back with her, hoping it would appease the hysteric. As they approached the entrance to the manor, she noticed the condemned sign on the door. There was a woman, she screamed against the wind, whilst the men shook their heads at her. The tunnel, she told them. Follow me. The little delegation walked across the hill to the edge of the cliff and to the coastal path. She led them to a tunnel carved into the rock, which opened onto a cave. There, lying on the floor, they found Gwyn's body, dark blood oozing from a deep gash on his forehead, already seeping into the ground. No, 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 Gwyn, she screamed, launching forward towards the lifeless body. I didn't mean... Her stomach twisted when she spotted the shards of wood scattered across the stony ground. She felt the men staring, judging her. She got to her feet and ran towards where the locked door had been, patting the walls in darkness, but all she found was rock, slippery with algae. It doesn't make any sense, she told them, her voice broken. 2 men from the village approached her then, speaking cautious words as if taming a wild beast. They restrained her, dragging her back to the mouth of the cave, whilst a 3rd man ran back to call the authorities. As the police took her away, she distinguished the silhouette of an ancient castle where the manor had stood a moment ago. She guessed at the presence of Gwyn and a woman at one of the windows. There, don't you see? She pointed, her voice begging. It's all right, love, one of the officers replied, his eyes never leaving the winding road. From the pub, the locals watched as the blue flashing lights receded in the distance. When all that was left was the night, they turned towards the old crooked man rocking by the fire. Hiraeth, he said. It belongs to her now. Some of the older men nodded, whispering to the younger lads about the price of betraying the land for a woman.